And with the wait finally over, Blender 4.0 is now here, and this comes with a lot of goodies. Blender 4.0 will be the last major release of Blender for the year 2023, and Blender 4.0 does come with a couple of cool improvements and features which will definitely change how Blender will be used moving forward. And for those who like to take a look at this, and probably you'd like to read the release notes and see some of the cool things that are now available in Blender 4.0, then you might want to go over to the link in the description that will bring you right here, where you can check it out. One of the things to keep in mind is Blender 4.0 has had a couple of pushbacks over time, and this boils down to the sheer amount of work that they've been putting into this particular release, as it is more of a foundational release leading to future updates and features that will be making their way to Blender. And as a testament, compatibility with Blender files has a little bit of an update, as Blender 3.6 LTS can read files saved with 4.0, but earlier versions cannot. Blender 3.6 LTS will be able to save meshes that are compatible with older versions of Blender and can be used as a conversion tool to move files from Blender 2.8, 3.4, 3.5, all the way to 4.0. Additionally, there's a new Blender compatibility policy file for those who like to read up on this, as this has now been implemented. One other thing which you'd also notice if you're looking at the release note is, contrary to what we had with previous releases of Blender and also their release note, Blender 4.0 now has a subsection of the user interface. Now within the user interface, we now have 3D viewport, node editor, and key maps. And with this said, we're going to take a look at some of the cool improvements and features that are now available in Blender, starting with the user interface. So once you open Blender 4.0 for the first time, you would notice that we have an amazing splash screen. A huge shout out to the creator for making this one possible. The splash screen has been redesigned in such a way that you can now bring in your previously saved settings to your new install, saving you that time of reconfiguring your Blender to fit into your previous settings over and over. So the UI now has an updated font. Contrary to what we had before, this is now considered to be more pleasing and more typographically correct. The color picker size has now been increased, which makes a lot of sense. It is also worth mentioning that at this point, you can now pick colors outside of Blender's window. The tree view UI now draws the hierarchy lines to visually indicate the nesting levels better. There's also a consistent top-down content ordering in menus, as menus no longer reverse orders if opening upwards. And if you go over to the rendering, you would notice that Eevee is now written in capital letter compared to what we had previously. There is now a beautiful save incremental button when you're saving files. And speaking about saving files, if you haven't saved your file, the text on saved in bracket will be found within the title bar. And if you're working on any file and you've made updates to that file without saving, there is now an asterisk to remind you to save that file. And if you go over to the modifier section, the modifier now has a new update. So instead of the typical dropdown that exists with Blender 3.6, you now have a bit of a nested modifier. This has been done in such a way that in upcoming updates of Blender, more modifiers can be stacked. And for those who are thinking about switching back to the previous modifier, there's a free add-on that can allow you to do that. And we've already talked about that on the channel, and I'm going to put a link to that in the description. If you go over to the preference window, you can now register the version of Blender that you're working with for all users. This gets to be associated with the compatible version of Blender files that you're working on, and there's also some very interesting Windows integration that now makes a lot of sense. One of them is if you do have multiple versions of Blender, you can now go over to the open with and find all of them within the Windows Explorer. You can also explore the quick access items and add them to your file browser system lists. And if you're into drag and drop, within the outliner, drag and drop works between multiple windows, making it quite convenient for anyone working in this way. And still speaking about viewport, there's a new preference to toggle Fresnel in edit mode. And when working with your model, the wire color is now available for all shading modes as well. Object/mode specific overlays have now been moved to their own popover, and in terms of statistics, you now have the ability to see per items and per selection counts while in object mode as well. Image preview in the file browser can now have a checkered background for transparent images, and if you're working with the file browser, this now shows the thumbnail preview of SVGs. The toolbar heading setter has now been updated, making it cleaner than what we had with 3.6. And if you're working with the object type visibility popover, it is now named selectability and visibility. Icons are now available for better visual visibility, and the text has now been aligned to the left, contrary to the right like what we have with 3.6. The snapping menu has also been reworked, with snap width being moved to the top of the popover, align rotation to target, and backface culling has now been moved closer to the snap target. The snap width, target selection, and align rotation rotation to target are no longer hidden by varying the mode and options. Project individual elements has now been replaced with face project option, and face nearest has been moved to stick together with the face project option. And for the transform viewport point, there's an update to that as well. Within the user interface, once you launch the add menu by hitting Shift and A on the keyboard, you can now start searching and finding stuff by typing. This takes away that one extra step of hitting Shift and tapping A on the keyboard, clicking on select and typing. More so, the recently searched items are now found on the top of the list, and you can actually change this if you want by simply going over to the preference window and disabling this. And within the node editor, the principal BSDF has now been rebuilt in such a way that you now have everything collapsed. So at this point, if you were trying to edit certain parts of your principal BSDF, you can now uncollapse them and make parameter updates to this before you proceed. The subsurface scatter no longer has color, and you now use the base color to drive both the subsurface and also the base. More on the principal BSDF when we start talking about some cool improvements to rendering. Some cool backburner updates includes that the 3D viewport background is now set to a single color in the default theme, since the vignette effects can lead to glitches in certain hardwares. This was reported by the community and has been addressed. Resizing the toolbar no longer breaks the snapping when dragging beyond the maximum available size. And in terms of translation, the Catalana language is now one of the 6 languages with complete coverage across Blender. So if you do speak that language, now you can use your native language and work with Blender. And with Blender 4.0 comes a couple of cool and impressive tools for geometry nodes. The node-based tools are now here, and this is an incredible way for anyone to customize and build tools that they can redistribute and use over time. The idea behind the node tools is for an accessible way to expand Blender and customize tools without requiring Python. And all of this can be done directly within the geometry node. And you can create as many tools as possible, although there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So with Blender 4.0 open right here, what you need to do if you would like to start creating your tools, have an object selected, go over to your geometry nodes, and then you can define a new geometry node. Meanwhile, you would notice down here that we have modifier and tool. So this implements that you can create either a modifier or you can create a tool. The tool which you're going to be creating would work within your edit mode, while the modifier will be found within the modifier stack. Now, if you have an idea of what you like to create, you can bang that out right here in geometry nodes and you can choose to save it. Now, once you have that, if you go over to your edit mode, you'll be able to have access to it. You can make modifications as many times as possible and also have access to that. This is also applicable to what you have with modifiers. So in this case, if you're also working with modifiers, it is also worth mentioning that you define what you want, connect the necessary groups that you need, and you can now get things going. For those who like to see a detailed video of how you can create your custom geometry node modifiers or your custom geometry node tools, we've made full videos about those in the channel, and I'm going to link them in the description. Meanwhile, if you're thinking about creating menu sets that you can work with, we'll also cover how you can do that. But just in case you were wondering, this gets to work within your asset browser. So within your asset browser, you need to define these as tools that you like to work with. So you need to define the first tool, in this case is scatter, and the second tool is voxel, and you need to save them inside of catalog called tools in another catalog called mods, and from there you can start working with them. In this case, if we go over to our modifier panel and we simply click on this button, you now notice my mods, tools, and the tools that we've made before, and all of the parameters to control this model exists right here. So just in case you're wondering if this is something that is super possible, yes it is, and you should definitely take full advantage of this, especially if you're into modeling and you do have a couple of modeling tasks that you like to automate or optimize. A very cool artist that's been doing amazing work with this is Team. So Team, known as the Passive Star, has been doing lots of stuff on Twitter. I did reach out to him and he mentioned that some of these tools that he's been creating and working on are fun projects, hence he's also putting out the entire geometry node setup. So just in case you like to follow up with him and probably you like to adopt some of the tools that he has already created, then you can also go ahead and check in with him on Twitter, or I'm gonna put links so you can check that out as well. Another cool feature which is now available within the geometry node is the repeat zone. The new repeat zone allows repeating nodes in a dynamic number of times, and this is great for those who are thinking about not using the simulation node, but rather you would like to repeat a particular node or a particular task on a node over a specific number of times. The mesh to volume node now generates a proper fork volume rather than the converted sine distance field. At the same time, rotation sockets and 8 new rotation nodes are available for simpler processing. More so, simulation nodes can now be baked individually, and simulation output nodes has a new skip input. So if you're into geometry nodes, then you will have a few time playing with all of these. Blender 4.0 ships with one tiny but necessary update for modeling, and this deals with the snap and navigate. So normally, when you're trying to get your model to snap to certain parts of another model, this can literally be a bit of a pain. But right now, once you have your model selected, you can simply press B on the keyboard to set the base point, and then you can transform that object onto any surface that you want. This also allows for a faster and precise snapping from vertex to vertex, and also gives you more options of how you get to position your mesh on other surfaces. Additionally, you can navigate while transforming your mesh by simply holding down Alt on the keyboard, and this is interesting. So at this point, it is possible for you to navigate while transforming your mesh, and the types of transforms that are supported includes move, rotate, scale, edge slide, vertex slide, and shrink/flatten. More so, we did mention that the snapping tool now has an update, and for those who are into snapping and probably want to explore that, there are a set of new snapping symbols that are now available, and you can go ahead and check this for yourself. And for animation and rigging, there's a couple of interesting things that make sense that I think a lot of people will enjoy. The pose library now uses the newly introduced asset shelf to make pose assets available within your 3D viewport. This is definitely a welcome development. Alongside this, bone collections and colors are now here. So the new bone collection now replaces both legacy numbered layers and bone groups, as the bone collections can now be named and are no longer limited to fixed numbers. Colors can now be specified individually on different bones, replacing the bone color group. So in this case, if we simply go ahead and throw in an amateur, we can now start doing some pretty cool stuff. So I'm just going to go over to the edit mode and add some extra joints. So with this, we can color these joints however we want. All we need to do is go over to the bone section, and if we go over to display, where we have our viewport display, we can choose a color. So we can say maybe we want this to have that color, and these are the color, and potentially we want it to have this color. Now whatever color that we put within the edit mode only exists within the edit mode. If we switch over and go to the pose mode and make changes to the pose of the model or of the joint, and we choose to give this another color, so all we need to do is have that selected, go back to where we have this, and we can change the color from the bone color to the pose color. So we could say maybe we like that to have that fuchsia looking color, and we might also want to have a red color right there, and potentially we might also want to have a purple color. So whatever color that we give here exists only in the pose mode. So where this makes a lot of sense is just in case you like to always identify what mode you are in without actually looking up here, this makes sense. So you're now within the edit mode, and now you're within the pose mode. And like we mentioned, bone collections are now a thing, so just in case you also like to select a given number of bones and put them into a collection, or assign them to a collection, or remove them from a collection, right now you can. And if you do work with Rigify, there is a new curved bone vertex mapping which is applied by a face upgrade operator for mouth corners. At the same time, there is also a new built-in spline tentacles rig based on spline IK. So just in case you like to work with these and probably you don't know where to get Rigify, Rigify ships directly with Blender, and all you need to do is go over to edit, go over to the preference, go over to your add-on section, and you'll be able to find Rigify right there. There's also fixes to the long-standing issue with preserving volume caused by distortion when rotation is combined with scale. More so, for bendy bones, there's a new method of mapping vertex to B-bones segments for deformation that takes the rest pose curvature into account. And for performance within the graph editor, Blender 4.0 outperforms Blender 3.6 between 5 to 10 times depending on how much zoom level you get to work with. And for those who are thinking about working with the graph editor, there is now some interesting new operands that are now available. The new graph editor operators now comes with interactive sliders for match slope, blend to ease, blend offset, share key, scale average, time offset, push and pull, with a Buttersworth smoothing filter that also helps to smooth out peak values in your animation. And for the NLA strip can now be vertically reordered, and strips can vertically be dragged through existing strips and locked tracks. And one of the interesting and most requested features that is now available in Blender 4.0 is light and shadow linking. With light linking, light can be set to affect specific objects within a scene, while shadow linking simply gives additional control over what objects act as shadow blockers for a given light. This would give artists more control over how they get to play with light, as they can now structure, decorate, and light their scenes however they choose, giving them controls to create a more mesmerizing and visually appealing images. And in the future versions of light linking, there are plans to support linking to the world light. Taking a look at the model made by Daniel, you can see that light linking has been used to artificially eliminate reflections on the eyes and tree branches. Path guiding now has a new update, as this now works on glossy surfaces in addition to diffuse surfaces. There's also the multi-scattering GGX, which now has a couple of improvements, and the principal hair BSDF now has a new variant called Huang, and this is added based on a paper, a microfacet base hair scattering model by Juan, Matthias, and Hanika. The idea behind this is to create a more nicer looking hair and also gives nicer focus reflections when viewed against light. There's update to Meta hardware ray tracing, as the new Apple M3 processor supports hardware ray tracing. Cycles now takes advantage of this by default. There's also an update to the open shader language and other performances, which includes Metal AMD GPU and AMD RDNA2 and RDNA3 APU now has support. Principal BSDF has been revamped. I like the whole compact form. First things which you'll notice is Sheen now uses a new microfiber shading model and is now found on top of the emission and coat. Traditionally, Sheen has been used for fuzzy cloth, but now can be used to add dust on arbitrary materials. At the same time, coat has now been placed above the emission layer. The subsurface scattering no longer has a subsurface scattering color. Instead, this uses the default color. There is also a subsurface scale input, which you can use to adjust the RGB radius. The multi-scattering GGX, like we mentioned earlier, is more efficient to render in cycles and is now there by default. And for those who are working with metallic and specular reflections, there are updates to that. One other one, which I think is very interesting to see, and of course I would suggest that you go ahead and play with it, is the Sheen BSDF. And by default, we've already talked about some of these parameters on the channel before, so just in case you like to catch up with those, you can now go ahead and see that. The Velvet BSDF node has now been renamed to the Sheen BSDF, and of course you can use this to create amazing looking materials for your model. For texture node, the noise texture and also the night texture now has a good number of inputs that you can now work with. At the same time, light UVs are now available for all light sources in the image texture node. So just in case you're thinking about doing some interesting things with light, right now you can. And while we speak about light and rendering, let's talk about the color management. So AGX View Transform has been added, and this simply replaces Filmic, and by default you can see that AGX is doing way better compared to what we had previously. This looks way more realistic, way more acceptable, and this is huge because this view transform now provides a better color handling in overexposed areas compared to what we had in Filmic. And in most cases, bright colors which Filmic would oversaturate, these colors actually peak all the way to white, similar to what you have in real cameras. So AGX is a win, and if you want to start rendering, I would suggest that you switch to this color transform and start using it. And for Viewport Compositing, the Viewport node now comes with a couple of cool stuff. One of them is movie distortion. This is a very interesting thing to work with, and of course if you're thinking about adding some sunbeams, or maybe you like to key out certain things or do some in-painting, you now have nodes that simply support that. There's also the double edge mask, which is very beautiful, and the Kuwahara filter is also a very cool filter that I believe a lot of people would enjoy working with. So just in case you like to get that stylized painterly feel in your scene in real time, then you can use the Kuwahara filter and get this going. Alongside this, the node view image has been moved to an overlay, which is now displayed on top of a given node. And the sequencer, which is one part of Blender that doesn't really get a lot of love, is having one interesting update, and that is the interactive retimer. So at this point, you can now retime strips depending on what you want to get. So you can have them selected, and you can either use the menus on the side to retime them, or you can hit Ctrl R, which is similar to DaVinci's Resolve shortcut key, and start retiming your strips. And if you're into assets, then you might want to consider taking a look at the Human-Based Meshes version 1.1. This is the brand new updated version of the Human-Based Meshes asset that the folks at Blender Foundation have given out. This now comes with some stylized, realistic, primitive, and planar models. And if you're into sculpting and texturing, there is an update to the keymaps, as the keymaps and shortcuts have been adjusted for usability and consistency across modes. For import and export, USD has a couple of interesting updates. There's also updates to 3D Studio Max, FBX, OBJ and PLY, Collada, and GLTF. The OBJ and PLY add-ons has now been removed, as importing and exporting these file formats is now implemented natively in Blender. But for those who are thinking about playing with USD and probably you're wondering how you can preview some of your USD files, you are in luck, because right now there is a new renderer in town, and that is called the Hydra Storm. So the Hydra Storm is a real-time renderer which is part of USD, but it is more like a very native viewport renderer that doesn't do so much. Compared to what you have with Eevee, its capabilities are pretty limited. This is just something that can help you preview your USD files before you export them, and you can also use them as references. And speaking of add-ons, we did mention Rigify, and of course the GLTF 2.0 import-export are also here. So tons of things are now available in Blender 4.0, and like I mentioned, Blender 4.0 is more like setting the pace for upcoming versions of Blender. So this is it. Tell me what you guys think about this one in the comment section. Links to all of the references are going to be in the description, and of course if you'd like to check out some of the other videos that we've made, links to them is also going to be in the description, so do well to check them out. Tell me what you guys think about this release in the comment section, and of course if you like this video or you learned something from this, you can go ahead and give it a like, and don't forget to share with a friend. And until I see you guys in the next one, peace.